these things, and that we must manage our debt. We must manage our debt in an orderly way, and no, you are not going to add. One day you've just walked in, just relax. You cannot add to what the Honorable Mbadi has said. The Honorable Mbadi has spoken, and I think we need to manage our debt well in this country. And that is the message that I have got that he has spoken to me. The Honorable Wahungu Wamalu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, first I want to congratulate Honorable Sakwa Bunyasi for coming up with this bill. Mr. Speaker, as we move forward, one of the rules in this House, Mr. Speaker, before a bill comes to the second reading, we must have a committee report. Mr. Speaker, there's no committee report up to now. And the committee report is supposed to have been done by the Committee of Finance. So the question you're asking, Mr. Speaker, we cannot put rules in place and we break our rules. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, as we move forward, this bill, Mr. Speaker, has overstayed on the shelves. And Mr. Speaker, why this bill is coming in place is we did not have full disclosure, Mr. Speaker, as far as the loans are concerned. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we are supporting this bill, that there must be an establishment.
The Honorable Chris Wamalwa, I think you need to correct the record. The report was shared. There's a report on this.
The report, when was it shared? Today, when I was in the table office, Mr. Speaker, I was told the report is not yet there.
No, the record,
and I've been looking for that report.
The record
if
shows.
It is there, then it's good. But it's important for me to have pointed out, because this bill was moved last, before the report was shared. So next time, the relevant bodies in this parliament, Mr. Speaker, they must share the report timely. Mr. Speaker, as I move forward, can you protect, Mr. Speaker, the consultations at high level, Mr. Speaker, should be at low level so that we can allow people to debate.
Members, the Honorable Wahungu desires to be heard as he should be. Kindly let us lower the consultation.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, as I move forward, I want to quote two professors from Harvard School. This is Professor Kaplan and Professor Norton, who developed the balanced scorecard model. And this is what they said, Mr. Speaker, that you cannot manage what you can't measure. And today in this country, Mr. Speaker, we don't have accurate records showing how much has the country borrowed up to date. Mr. Speaker, as we speak right now in 2019, there was a motion on the floor of this House where members were being convinced, Mr. Speaker, that we should increase the debt ceiling to 9 trillion. And Mr. Speaker, the reason was like this. We were to get the concessional loans, Mr. Speaker, because concessional loans normally you pay back at a longer period, and when it comes to the interest rate, Mr. Speaker, it is somehow insignificant. And the objective of these concessional loans, Mr. Speaker, was to restructure the commercial loans that the government had borrowed. Mr. Speaker, up to now, we've never been told whether the rescheduling of these loans was done or not. But from the performance, Mr. Speaker, it shows clearly, Mr. Speaker, there's loud consultation, Mr. Speaker. I can hardly speak. Mr. Speaker, I need your protection.
Honorable members, the elder of the House, the Honorable Chris can't breathe.
Absolutely. And the chair of PAC should listen to this, Mr. Speaker. Because when we increased the ceiling to 9 trillion, the critical objective was to get the concessional loans, which are paid back at a longer period and a lower rate, so that they restructure the commercial expensive loans. The question you're asking, and the body should be answering this because it's part of the budget committee, whether the restructuring of these commercial loans was done or not. Because we've never gotten any report. At that time, Mr. Speaker, we need a thorough follow-up, because that was the critical objective why we increased the ceiling to 9 trillion. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, on the issue of this body that Honorable Sakwa Bunyasi is trying to put across, one of the critical functions we've read, Mr. Speaker, it is supposed to maintain a register of all loans that are advanced to the national government, the county government, and their entities, including the guaranteed by the national government. It is important because, Mr. Speaker, some times back, I had raised a question on the floor of this House to be told how much loans are we owing. We've not had the correct figures. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, we've had people talking of 8.2 trillion, others talking of 9 trillion, others talking of 11 trillion. And it will add value, Mr. Speaker, if this bill passes, because it will be a one-stop shop, Mr. Speaker, whereby anybody will be able to know. When you read Article 35 of the Constitution, Mr. Speaker, it's clear. It says Kenyans have a right to information. If members of parliament, even those on the budget committee, up to now, we don't even know which one is the correct figure, Mr. Speaker. But if anything to go by, if we go by 8.2 trillion of what the budget committee has put in place, is it good enough, Mr. Speaker? When we increased the ceiling in 2019 to 9 trillion, it is supposed to have gone up to 2024 in June. But if by now in 2021 we've already gone 95%, Mr. Speaker, on a pro rata basis, it shows we're not doing pretty well. It is true, Mr. Speaker, governments must be borrow, but they must borrow wisely. And as you borrow wisely, Mr. Speaker, you must bring programs that are going to add value. Programs, Mr. Speaker, that are going to be development in nature. If we are going to borrow, Mr. Speaker, and as Honorable Badi puts it, you are going to hire people of NYS to go and clean Kibera streets. That is wrong. Because the money we borrow, Mr. Speaker, it should be focused on infrastructure, things to do with the development. At the moment, Mr. Speaker, the rule of thumb internationally, when you want to look at the borrowing and the GDP, that is the ratio that is being used. When President Moi left power, Mr. Speaker, Kenya had borrowed around 650 billion or so. When Mwai Kibaki left power, he had left the debt ceiling. At that time, we had borrowed up to around 1.8 trillion. But look now the way Jubilee government has borrowed, Mr. Speaker. It has gone on a spending spree, Mr. Speaker. And the rule of thumb, as it says, the ratio of the GDP, when Mwai Kibaki left government, the percentage, the ratio of borrowing to the GDP was around 47-50%. And the international standard, Mr. Speaker, in the developing economies, the rule of thumb is it should be around 50% in the economies that are developing. We cannot compare ourselves to the United States of America, or you compare ourselves to Japan, where borrowing is in excess of 100%. We are a developing economy, Mr. Speaker. We are not a developed economy. As we speak right now, the Jubilee government, when you look at the ratio of public debt and the GDP, it's already 100%, Mr. Speaker. This is something that you must be examined, so that when we borrow, the borrowing must be focused towards programs of development in nature. And Honorable Makali mentioned it. How has the distribution been done in terms of these programs? They are skewed. And when we borrow, Mr. Speaker, the burden goes to the common mwananchi. I remember the slogan at that time, during Mwai Kibaki's time, that kulipa ushuru ni kujitegemea. As we borrow, it is the common mwananchi who is going to pay in terms of taxes and levies. When you look at the cost of fuel right now, Mr. Speaker, as we speak, right now, 60% of the cost of fuel is attributed to the tax and levies. Why has this been increased? Because of the obligation, Mr. Speaker, the country has to meet when it comes to the issues of paying the debt. So as we move forward, Mr. Speaker, we are not saying borrowing should not be done, but let's borrow based on our capacity. Let's not borrow as if we are in the United States, Mr. Speaker, or as if it's in Japan. This is why it is wrong, Mr. Speaker. And as we move forward, Mr. Speaker, reports have been tabled in this parliament, Mr. Speaker, showing 30% of the GDP goes into wastage through corruption, Mr. Speaker. We have agencies that fight corruption. And when you look at the level of wastages, Mr. Speaker, particularly post-handshake, when Honorable Badi talks about the issue of KEMSA billionaires, the KEMSA billionaires, Mr. Speaker, it is coming as a result of the post-handshake. And the people who have been mentioned, Mr. Speaker, widely on these KEMSA billionaires, they are affiliated on the handshake, Mr. Speaker. So the truth of the matter is this. Let's look at this matter and handle it objectively, Mr. Speaker. This is a matter that must be looked effectively. My friend here was talking Luoland, the other side. Now he's just jumped here. He doesn't even know what I said, Mr. Speaker. Maybe he's one of the beneficiaries of KEMSA billionaires. Somebody who is corrupt is corrupt. And Mr. Speaker,
the Honorable Chris Wamalwa, now you have attracted the point of order that Wandai wishes. It is now a proper point of order. The Honorable Wandai,
Mr. Speaker, is it in order for the Honorable Chris Wamalwa to refer derogatively to the Luo nation in the manner he has done
The Honorable
on the
Chris
floor of the
Wamalwa,
National
just
Assembly?
withdraw that, please.
Can he withdraw and apologize to the great people of the Luo community?
Just withdraw that.
Mr. Speaker, I apologize, but I never say that. He was speaking to my friend, Honorable the MP for Bondo. He was speaking Luo. That's what I said. He was speaking Luo. I never said the Luo nation, Mr. Speaker. And every language is allowed in this house, Mr.
You have
Speaker.
apologized, you cannot...
So I've withdrawn the statement, Mr. Speaker. Yes. So on the way forward, Mr. Speaker, the government that comes in 2022 is only God who knows who will be forming the next government. The budget policy statement, Mr. Speaker, it is supposed to give priority areas as far as expenditure is concerned. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, for us to increase the bracket of paying taxes, Mr. Speaker, that's why we are focusing on the bottom-up economic model, Mr. Speaker. And we do support what Honorable Musalia Mudavadi mentioned, him himself as an economist, Mr. Speaker. It was important for us to put in place, because this BPS, Mr. Speaker, up to now, it was withdrawn from the order paper. Up to now, we don't understand why.
The Honorable Chris, your time has run. The Honorable Ndindi Nyoro, member for Kiharu.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for this opportunity. And I want to support Honorable Sakwa Bunyasi on the transparency in far as borrowing and public debt is concerned. And Mr. Speaker, my thought is that we should actually elevate the authority into a commission, because we need a standalone institution that is totally independent. And I say so because, Mr. Speaker, our country is currently indebted in a way that is unsustainable. Mr. Speaker, comparatively, our nation, our African peers, and even beyond Africa, our economy and our country is in red. We have also seen commentaries across the world in terms of the indebtedness of our nation. And therefore, this is a matter that is out there, and Mr. Speaker, it pinches more to us as Kenyans. Mr. Speaker, we have actually borrowed beyond the legal limits as a country. This House has set a limit of 9 trillion Kenya shillings insofar as the domestic and the foreign debt combined is concerned. And Mr. Speaker, it was very embarrassing sitting here and listening to pedestrian arguments from some of the people who actually hold even positions of leadership in this House, who, Mr. Speaker, clearly do not know the condition of the debt in this country, have no correct figures, and therefore they do not even understand the role on which they hold in terms of leading this House. Mr. Speaker, the current debt in this country is a whopping 11.7 trillion Kenya shillings. And Mr. Speaker, therefore, that is even beyond what we have said here in Parliament. I say so because when you see at the data and look at the data as reported by the Central Bank of Kenya, it is in excess of 8.4 trillion, Mr. Speaker. But the debts that are guaranteed to SOEs, that is the state-owned enterprises, parastatals, and other government agencies, Mr. Speaker, they exceed 3.4 trillion. And Mr. Speaker, in the economic terms, in the economic angle, there is no other way to treat those debts other than loading them over to be part of the national public debt. Mr. Speaker, just last year, our country was actually forced by the IMF to be clear in terms of the actual debt in this country. And by around that time, Mr. Speaker, that is when we actually realized that our debt has not been including a very serious component, that is the guarantee by GOK to SOEs and other parastatals. Mr. Speaker, how do you treat a debt, for example, that is owed by a water company, let's say in Rwanda, in Busia, in Muranga, in Mombasa? These water companies are government entities, and any debt they borrow, Mr. Speaker, the guarantor is the government of Kenya. In the event, and in the many events that they do not are not able to pay, Mr. Speaker, that debt is loaded over to be part of the national debt. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, our current debt is actually over 110% debt to GDP ratio, that is in excess massively of the over 70-something% that is reported here by the Treasury, Mr. Speaker, which is an actual lie. Mr. Speaker, a Kenyan citizen, even a child born today, is indebted to a tune of 255,000, what is called debt per capita. Every Kenyan, Mr. Speaker, is indebted, let me repeat, to a tune of 255,000. When President Kibaki retired, Mr. Speaker, that debt per capita was just around 48,000 per every Kenyan. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we can see the trajectory. Let me give the actual statistics because I had some other pedestrian ones. And Mr. Speaker, anyone can go to the CBK website. You can find out that when President Kibaki retired, the debt load in this country, the debt portfolio, the combined domestic and foreign, was around 1.8 trillion. By the time we are wrapping up the 2017 calendar year, it was just around 4.5 trillion Kenya shillings. And therefore, the net borrowing in the first year of this regime was just around 2.7 trillion, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, from the handshake time, and these are the facts, from 2018 to date, that debt has accumulated to 11.7 trillion. And therefore, the net debt in the handshake era is actually 7.2 trillion Kenya shillings. Mr. Speaker, what you are asking, where is this money? We can see it, we cannot trace it. I also had some other people, Mr. Speaker, in this house, referencing other economies like Japan. And I want to respond with the real Japan. Mr. Speaker, I agree with those who are bringing or entertaining the arguments that countries borrow. And they said Japan. Actually, the actual Japan debt to GDP ratio is around 237%, which I agree is beyond the 100% of Kenya. But Mr. Speaker, that is so pedestrian because there are issues that we must look at very closely when we are talking about the issue of public debt. Number one is cost. Japan, Mr. Speaker, Japanese government is paid to borrow. What do I mean? The 10-year yield of a Japanese board, Mr. Speaker, Japanese government board, is actually negative earning, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, the government of Japan is actually paid to borrow. The same equivalent, the 10-year board of the government of Kenya, is in excess of 13%. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, there is actually nothing to compare. Number two, there is something called forex. Most of our debt that is foreign is dollar denominated. Mr. Speaker, our country has got over 5 trillion of foreign debt. Anytime there is a variation of only 1% of dollar to Kenya shilling, Mr. Speaker, our debt portfolio increases by over 50 billion. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, we cannot compare Kenya and Japan or even with the US. But more importantly, there is something called net borrowing. When we talk about national public debt, we actually take the figure of the monies that the government has borrowed. In retrospect, Mr. Speaker, our country, Kenya, lends to no one. We only borrow. And I'm actually using the same site of Japan. The Japanese government, yes, they have borrowed in excess of 237%. But, Mr. Speaker, they have lent more money outside than they have borrowed. Actually, Japan is the highest net lender to the US government. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, the Japanese government actually makes money in borrowing to lend. And therefore, there is no comparison also there. Mr. Speaker, let me give you a citation of how much our country has borrowed and how much a proportion can actually do to the livelihood of the Kenyan people. The 7.2 trillion is borrowed by this regime from the handshake era. Mr. Speaker, just half of that, just around 3.56 trillion, can do the following. And I want the Kenyan people to listen carefully. The president always talks about the 10,000 kilometers of road tarmacked by this regime. If we actually double the 10,000 kilometers to 20,000 kilometers at a rate of 60 million, when we have even put in a cut for the brokers, 60 million per kilometer, that's around 1.2 trillion, Mr. Speaker. The Kenya National Bureau of Statistics gives us the data that Kenya has got 12 million households. When President Kibaki retired, 2 million of those had connection to electricity. Mr. Speaker, connecting the 10,000 remaining to electricity without even the government subsidy, and therefore we put it at 35,000, that is 350 billion, Mr. Speaker. If you are to connect the other 10,000 households to safe drinking water at 10 million households, Mr. Speaker, at 50,000 per household, that is around 500 billion, Mr. Speaker. If we are to build a level 5 hospital in every constituency in Kenya, that is 290 billion. Forget about the Tibet, Mr. Speaker. If we are to build a university of 1 billion Kenya shillings, if we add on even the SGR, Mr. Speaker, of 350 billion, that comes to below 3.5 trillion, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, what this borrowing has been perpetuating is something called development corruption. This government, led by those people in the highest offices, have captured our economy. Let me cite, for example, this expressway here. During President Kibaki's era, this expressway was to cost just around 25 billion. Currently, it's costing in excess of 80 billion, Mr. Speaker. Where is this money going? To pockets of some people. Let me also cite the SGR. We spent over 400 billion Kenyan taxpayers' money.
The Honorable